Throughout history, certain virtues have been celebrated across nearly all cultures: courage, honesty, justice, wisdom. Yet one supposed virtue stands apart, uniquely emphasized within Christian teaching, while rejected in many other ethical systems: humility. This anomaly raises a profound question. Why would Christianity elevate as its central virtue something that many sophisticated moral traditions either ignored or actively cautioned against? What if this reveals something fundamental about how moral systems function and whom they truly serve? Consider the stark contrast. Classical Greek and Roman ethics celebrated magnanimity and proper pride, knowing your worth and acting accordingly. Aristotle condemned excessive humility as a vice, a deficiency of proper self-valuation. Eastern traditions emphasized self-cultivation and dignity rather than self-abasement. Yet Christianity inverted this pattern, declaring humility the foundation of all virtues while condemning pride as the deadliest sin. This radical departure wasn't merely a slight adjustment, but a fundamental revaluation of human excellence. The mystery deepens when we observe humility in practice. Those who champion humility as a virtue are rarely themselves particularly humble. Religious leaders who preach meekness and self-effacement often enjoy positions of considerable power, prestige, and sometimes wealth. Meanwhile, those in genuine weakness and vulnerability are consistently counseled to embrace their lowly status as spiritually beneficial. This asymmetry suggests something more complex than simple spiritual wisdom, a pattern where humility seems suspiciously beneficial to those in power while constraining those without it. Even more telling is the psychological mechanism through which humility operates. Unlike courage, which strengthens the individual, or wisdom, which illuminates, humility fundamentally involves diminishment, making oneself lower, smaller, less significant. It's the only virtue that begins with the premise that there's something inherently problematic about your natural state that must be continually corrected through self-restriction. Other virtues enhance human potential. Humility uniquely appears to constrain it. Why would a moral system designate self-limitation as the highest good, unless it served some purpose beyond individual well-being? A 19th-century philosopher, often vilified by religious authorities, developed a revolutionary analysis that might explain this anomaly. His perspective suggested that the elevation of humility to virtue status wasn't an innocent recognition of spiritual truth, but a sophisticated moral inversion that served specific power interests. This insight wasn't speculation, but emerged from meticulous analysis of how moral systems evolve within social hierarchies. What he discovered about humility was deemed so threatening that his work was systematically mischaracterized and suppressed. What if humility, rather than being the divine virtue we've been taught to revere, is actually a brilliantly disguised tool of psychological control? What if the emphasis on being humble serves primarily to keep certain people compliant, while allowing others to exercise power without challenge? And what if this seemingly gentle virtue actually prevents the development of the authentic human excellence it claims to foster? The implications would transform not just our understanding of Christian morality, but our entire approach to personal development. I invite you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about this celebrated virtue. What if the path to genuine growth requires not more humility, but its transcendence? Let's examine a pattern that emerges when we look closely at how humility functions in religious contexts. A pattern so consistent yet overlooked that it suggests something fundamental about this virtue's actual purpose. While all virtues should theoretically apply equally to everyone, humility displays a remarkable asymmetry in how it's prescribed across social hierarchies. Consider how religious teachings about humility are applied differently depending on one's position. Those already in power receive humility as a gentle corrective, a reminder not to become too arrogant. Yet for those in positions of weakness or marginality, humility becomes a comprehensive demand, not just a corrective, but a defining characteristic expected to govern their entire way of being. Women in traditional religious contexts are urged toward radical self-effacement far more intensely than men. The poor are counseled to embrace humble contentment, while the wealthy receive milder admonitions about generosity. This consistent asymmetry appears across denominations, historical periods, and cultural contexts, suggesting something structural rather than coincidental. This pattern extends beyond application to enforcement. When powerful figures display pride, it's typically treated as a venial sin, unfortunate but understandable. When marginalized individuals display the same qualities, it's condemned far more harshly as spiritual rebellion or evidence of moral corruption. Medieval religious texts explicitly prescribed different standards of humility based on social class, with peasants expected to embrace their lowliness as divinely ordained, while nobles merely needed to acknowledge God's ultimate authority over their rightful power. This double standard wasn't an aberration but a consistent feature of how humility functions within religious frameworks. Even more telling is how religious communities respond when this asymmetry is questioned. Those who suggest that perhaps the humility demanded of the marginalized might be excessive are typically met not with reasoned debate, but with moral condemnation, accused of pride, arrogance, or spiritual immaturity. This circular defense makes the virtue nearly immune to criticism. Questioning the demands of humility becomes itself evidence of insufficient humility, creating a closed system where the virtue's uneven application cannot be examined without confirming the need for its prescription. The anomaly becomes even more striking when we examine humility's relationship to psychological health. While most virtues correlate positively with well-being, excessive humility shows disturbing correlations with depression, diminished self-efficacy, vulnerability to exploitation, and suppressed autonomy. Studies of religious communities with the strongest emphasis on humility reveal higher rates of psychological dependency and reduced capacity for critical thinking. Yet despite these concerning patterns, the virtue continues to be prescribed without qualification. Most puzzlingly, when we examine Jesus' life and teachings, we find someone who displayed remarkable self-assertion, challenging authorities, claiming divine identity, and unhesitatingly asserting moral truths. His humility, when displayed, was selective and contextual rather than comprehensive. Yet somehow the religion founded in his name transformed this complex pattern into an absolute demand for self-diminishment. How did a spiritual teacher who boldly declared, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," become the foundation for a moral system that makes self-assertion a primary sin? What if humility, as constructed within Christian teaching, isn't about spiritual truth, but about maintaining social control? In autumn 1879, Friedrich Nietzsche found himself in a small rented room in the Italian seaside town of Genoa. His health was deteriorating. Crippling migraines, near blindness, and severe digestive problems had forced him to resign his university professorship. Isolated, physically suffering, and facing financial uncertainty, Nietzsche entered a period of intense philosophical productivity that would produce some of his most revolutionary insights. What positioned Nietzsche uniquely to see what others couldn't was his unusual intellectual journey. Trained initially in classical philology, the detailed study of ancient texts in their original languages, he possessed extraordinary ability to analyze how concepts evolved over time. More importantly, he'd been raised in a devoutly religious household. His father was a Lutheran pastor, but had moved away from Christianity through careful intellectual examination rather than rebellious rejection. This gave him both intimate knowledge of Christian moral teaching and critical distance from it, a combination that allowed him to recognize patterns that those either fully embedded within or completely outside the tradition typically missed. During his daily walks along the Mediterranean coast, when his health permitted, Nietzsche contemplated a question that few had asked before. How do moral systems come into existence, and whom do they ultimately serve? Rather than accepting moral principles as divinely revealed or rationally self-evident, he applied a genealogical approach, tracing virtues back to their historical origins and psychological functions. This methodology led him to a shocking insight about humility that would form a central pillar of his philosophical project. In his notebook from this period, Nietzsche wrote, "The most astounding invention in the history of morality was the revaluation that transformed natural human power into sin and natural human weakness into virtue. This wasn't idle speculation, but the result of meticulous analysis of how Christian moral concepts had evolved from earlier ethical frameworks. He observed how pre-Christian moral systems typically celebrated qualities that enhanced life, power, and human flourishing, while Christianity had systematically inverted this pattern, condemning natural human drives while elevating their opposites as virtues. What distinguished Nietzsche's analysis from mere criticism was his insight into the psychological mechanism behind this moral inversion. He recognized that the elevation of humility to virtue status wasn't random, but served specific psychological and social functions. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he would later develop this insight into a comprehensive theory of how moral systems emerge not from divine revelation, but from power dynamics between different types of human beings with different natural dispositions and capacities. During those walks in Genoa, Nietzsche began formulating his concept of slave morality, the idea that Christianity represented a moral revolution engineered by those who lacked natural power and needed to create a moral framework that would condemn the qualities they couldn't attain while elevating those they already possessed. This wasn't a conspiracy theory, but a psychological analysis. The powerless didn't consciously invent these values as manipulation, but unconsciously developed them as a means of psychological survival in a world where they couldn't compete directly for power. Humility stood at the center of this analysis. Nietzsche saw that by transforming natural human self-assertion into the sin of pride, while elevating self-abasement as the virtue of humility, Christianity had created a moral framework that effectively condemned natural expressions of human vitality, while sanctifying their absence or suppression. What if the command to be humble isn't about making you better, but about making you easier to control? Nietzsche's first compelling evidence appears in his analysis of how the concept of humility evolved historically. In Daybreak, published in 1881, he traces the transformation of tapeinosis, the Greek term later translated as humility, from a purely negative concept in classical thought to a supreme virtue in Christian teaching. This evolution wasn't random but corresponded precisely with a transfer of cultural power from aristocratic warrior classes to priestly classes who lacked physical strength but possessed intellectual and organizational advantages. The revaluation of humility from vice to virtue coincided exactly with this power shift, suggesting a causal relationship rather than divine revelation. Consider the historical pattern. In pre-Christian Greek ethics, tapinosis was universally considered a character flaw. Aristotle explicitly categorized it as a vice, the deficiency of proper pride. Roman virtue ethics similarly valued dignitas and gravitas, qualities antithetical to self-abasement. Yet within a few centuries of Christianity's emergence, this consensus had been completely reversed, with humility elevated to the status of foundational virtue. Nietzsche documented how this transformation occurred not through new spiritual insights, but through a systematic reinterpretation of existing moral language to serve different psychological and social needs. The evidence extends beyond conceptual evolution to specific textual analysis. Nietzsche examined how early Christian writings subtly transformed the meaning of moral terms. For instance, the Greek word megalopsychia, greatness of soul, considered a virtue by Aristotle, became progressively associated with sinful pride, while tapinosis shifted from designating a shameful lowliness to signifying a spiritually advanced state. This linguistic transformation wasn't merely a shift in terminology, but a complete inversion of the moral valuation attached to natural human capacities and their expression. Literary evidence provides another layer of confirmation. Analyzing texts from different historical periods, Nietzsche observed a consistent pattern. As Christianity gained cultural dominance, literary portrayals of heroic self-assertion shifted from positive to negative, while depictions of self-abasement transformed from pathetic to admirable. The cultural ideal shifted from the self-confident hero to the humble saint, not because the latter demonstrated greater human excellence, but because the moral framework through which excellence itself was evaluated had been fundamentally inverted. Perhaps most revealing is the evidence from early Christian disputes about the nature of humility. Nietzsche documented how the Church Fathers, who most emphatically championed humility as a virtue, were precisely those from backgrounds lacking traditional aristocratic virtues, while those from noble families often emphasized more moderate interpretations. Tertullian, from a modest provincial background, advocated a radical humility that condemned all natural human pride. Clement of Alexandria, from a more aristocratic tradition, offered a more balanced view that preserved aspects of classical virtue alongside Christian values. This correlation between social background and theological position suggests that the elevation of humility wasn't merely spiritual insight, but reflected specific psychological needs and social interests. All these evidence streams converge on a revolutionary conclusion. Humility wasn't elevated to virtue status because it represented objective moral excellence, but because it served the psychological and social interests of those who lacked the natural power celebrated in earlier moral systems. This doesn't mean the revaluation was consciously manipulative. Those who elevated humility genuinely believed in its spiritual value. But the psychological function of this belief was to transform qualities they naturally possessed, or their opposites that they naturally lacked, into spiritual advantages rather than disadvantages. This historical analysis reveals that what has been presented as timeless divine truth about humility actually emerged from specific psychological and social conditions, raising profound questions about its claim to universal moral authority. To understand how humility functions as a moral tool rather than a mere virtue, we must examine what Nietzsche called the psychological mechanism of virtue creation. This process begins not with divine revelation or rational reflection, but with the basic human need to feel valuable and morally justified. When a group lacks the qualities celebrated in dominant moral frameworks, they face a choice: either accept their moral inferiority or create an alternative moral system that redefines what counts as virtuous. The elevation of humility represents the most successful example of this psychological process in Western cultural history. This transformation follows predictable stages that Nietzsche identified across diverse cultural contexts. First comes the experience of powerlessness in a world that celebrates qualities one lacks: strength, beauty, confidence, natural dominance. Next arises resentment toward those who possess these qualities and the moral frameworks that celebrate them. Then emerges the creative psychological response, reinterpreting one's own lack as spiritually superior to others' abundance. The final stage involves universalizing this reinterpretation, transforming a specific psychological coping mechanism into a supposedly universal moral truth. Humility follows precisely this pattern, transforming the natural self-diminishment that comes from powerlessness into a spiritual virtue supposedly superior to natural confidence and power. Nietzsche documented this pattern in religious literature across traditions. When a religious movement emerges from marginalized populations, it consistently elevates humility, meekness, and self-abasement as virtues, while condemning natural human power as spiritually dangerous. When religions emerge from aristocratic or powerful classes, they typically emphasize virtues compatible with power, honor, glory, magnificence, while treating humility as appropriate only for those of naturally lower status. This consistent correlation between a religion's social origins and its moral emphasis on humility provides compelling evidence that the virtue serves specific psychological and social functions rather than representing universal spiritual truth. The evidence becomes even more compelling when examining how humility functions psychologically. Nietzsche collected accounts showing how the practice of humility creates a specific form of consciousness that makes individuals easier to govern. By constantly focusing attention on one's flaws, limitations, and unworthiness, humility produces what he called the guilty conscience, a state where the individual preemptively judges and condemns themselves, making external control less necessary. This self-policing function explains why humility has been so consistently emphasized by religious and political authorities throughout history. Not because it makes people spiritually advanced, but because it makes them easier to manage. Modern psychological research has substantially confirmed Nietzsche's insights. Studies show that excessive focus on one's limitations correlates with reduced capacity for independent judgment and increased susceptibility to authority. People primed with humility-related concepts become more compliant with external demands and less likely to question hierarchical structures. This psychological pattern explains why the virtue has been so consistently prescribed for those already in subordinate positions. It transforms the external fact of subordination into an internal virtue, reducing the likelihood of resistance while increasing our amenability to control. What's particularly significant about this evidence is how it explains the asymmetrical application of humility across social hierarchies. The virtue isn't universally prescribed because it isn't universally useful for maintaining the social order. Those in power benefit from others' humility far more than from practicing it themselves. Hence, the consistent pattern where humility is demanded most stringently from those already lacking social power. This functional analysis explains why, despite theological claims about universal application, the actual practice of humility has always shown remarkably consistent correlation with existing power structures. This understanding doesn't deny that humility might sometimes serve legitimate spiritual purposes, but it reveals that what has been presented as pure spiritual wisdom has consistently functioned as a sophisticated mechanism for psychological and social control, raising profound questions about its unqualified celebration as a virtue. As we assemble the evidence, a consistent pattern emerges that Nietzsche articulated in Beyond Good and Evil, but that religious authorities have consistently resisted. What he called the great moral inversion isn't limited to humility as an isolated virtue, but represents a comprehensive revaluation of human qualities that serve specific psychological and social functions. This pattern has profound implications for how we understand not just humility, but the entire moral framework of which it forms a central part. The pattern begins with how Christianity categorizes human qualities. Across its moral teachings, Nietzsche observed a consistent tendency to condemn as sinful precisely those qualities that reflect natural human vitality, power and excellence: pride, self-assertion, confidence, ambition, desire, while elevating as virtuous their opposites: humility, self-denial, obedience, contentment with little, suspicion of desire. This categorization isn't random, but follows a specific logic. Qualities that would naturally emerge from a position of strength and abundance are systematically condemned, while qualities that would naturally emerge from a position of weakness and deprivation are systematically celebrated. At the institutional level, the pattern continues with what Nietzsche called the sanctification of resentment. Religious systems consistently transform what began as a psychological response to powerlessness into a moral framework supposedly reflecting divine will. The natural human response to being unable to compete directly for power, resentment toward those who possess it, becomes sublimated into a moral system that condemns the very qualities one cannot attain. This transformation serves institutional purposes by creating a moral framework that simultaneously delegitimizes the natural authority of the powerful while legitimizing the authority of religious institutions that claim to represent divine rather than natural power. The historical pattern reveals itself in how Christianity's emphasis on humility coincided precisely with its shift from a marginalized sect to a dominant cultural force. In its earliest phases as a religion of the powerless, Christianity emphasized humility as a direct counterpoint to Roman values of honor and pride. As it gained institutional power, the emphasis subtly shifted. Humility remained central to Christian teaching, but became increasingly prescribed for the laity rather than church leadership, for women rather than men, for the poor rather than the wealthy. This evolution reveals the functional rather than purely spiritual nature of the virtue. Its prescription always aligns with existing power dynamics rather than challenging them. Perhaps most revealing is the pattern Nietzsche identified in how moral psychology operates within Christian frameworks. He observed that the celebration of humility creates a specific form of consciousness, characterized by constant self-suspicion, ongoing guilt, and perpetual sense of moral inadequacy. This psychological state makes individuals highly susceptible to external moral authority and unlikely to trust their own judgment, creating the perfect conditions for institutional control. The genius of elevating humility to virtue status lies precisely in how it creates internal psychological conditions that facilitate external governance, while making that facilitation appear spiritually beneficial rather than politically convenient. The pattern extends to how Christian moral teaching approaches the body and natural human desires. Nietzsche documented how consistently Christianity associates bodily vitality, sensual pleasure, and natural human drives with spiritual danger, while associating their denial or diminishment with spiritual advancement. This pattern makes perfect sense if the moral system functions to delegitimize natural human power, which is inherently embodied, while legitimizing institutional authority, which claims disembodied divine authorization. Humility serves as the linchpin in this system, the virtue that justifies the overall devaluation of natural human capacities and desires. What makes this pattern particularly difficult to recognize is how thoroughly it has shaped our cultural understanding of morality itself. The Christian revaluation of humility hasn't remained confined to explicitly religious contexts, but has permeated Western moral consciousness at every level. The implications of Nietzsche's analysis extend far beyond academic philosophy into the practical reality of how we understand virtue, personal development, and human excellence. If humility as traditionally conceived isn't a universal spiritual virtue, but a psychologically sophisticated tool that serves specific interests, then many of our basic assumptions about moral development require fundamental reconsideration. This isn't merely a theoretical concern, but has profound consequences for how we approach our own growth and potential. First, we must confront what Nietzsche called the moral trap, the way traditional virtue frameworks can actually obstruct authentic human development. When humility is prescribed as an unconditional virtue, it creates a paradoxical bind. The more diligently you practice making yourself small, the more you diminish the very qualities that make genuine excellence possible. Natural confidence becomes suspect as pride. Healthy self-assertion becomes condemned as arrogance. Appropriate ambition becomes rejected as sinful striving. This creates a closed system where the pursuit of virtue actively undermines the development of excellence, a pattern that explains why the most scrupulously humble individuals often display a curious combination of moral superiority and practical ineffectiveness. The psychological implications are equally significant. If humility, as traditionally conceived, involves the systematic devaluation of natural human capacities, then its practice can create specific forms of psychological harm. Nietzsche observed how the constant focus on one's limitations and unworthiness produces what modern psychology would call diminished self-efficacy, reduced belief in one's capacity to act effectively in the world. This psychological state doesn't enhance spiritual development, but actively impedes it by making the individual increasingly dependent on external authority, rather than developing internal moral resources. True spiritual advancement might require not more humility, but its reconceptualization away from self-diminishment towards something more life-affirming. For relationships and community, the implications are particularly challenging. If humility has historically functioned to maintain rather than transform power dynamics, then its unqualified celebration within communities perpetuates rather than challenges existing hierarchies. Communities that elevate humility as the supreme virtue typically display a curious pattern. They maintain extremely rigid power structures while making those structures appear spiritually justified rather than socially constructed. This explains why religious communities that most emphasize humility often demonstrate the least actual social equality. The virtue functions to make inequality appear morally appropriate rather than challenging it at a structural level. Perhaps most profound is the implication for how we understand human potential itself. If the Christian conception of humility emerged from specific psychological and social conditions rather than representing universal moral truth, then we might need to fundamentally reconsider what genuine human excellence looks like. Nietzsche suggested that true virtue might lie not in the denial of natural human power, but in its responsible cultivation and expression. Rather than diminishing ourselves through humility, we might develop what he called the great health, a condition where natural human vitality is neither denied as sinful nor expressed as domination, but channeled into creative and life-affirming forms. This doesn't mean abandoning all forms of humility, but reconceiving it entirely. Rather than self-diminishment, genuine humility might involve accurate self-assessment, recognizing both one's capacities and limitations without exaggerating either. Rather than making yourself artificially small, it might mean embracing your natural scale, not pretending to be less than you are, nor claiming to be more. Rather than constant self-suspicion, It might involve the honest acknowledgement of your actual motivations without either condemning or glorifying them. This reconceived humility would serve human flourishing rather than institutional control. These implications suggest a radical but liberating possibility. What if the path to genuine spiritual and psychological development requires not more of the humility we've been taught to practice, but its fundamental transformation into something more life-affirming and authentically empowering? Why has this understanding of humility been so consistently suppressed or marginalized within religious and moral discourse? Nietzsche identified what he called the conspiracy of virtue, not a conscious deception, but a multi-layered system that maintains humility as an unquestionable good, despite evidence of its problematic nature and functions. This conspiracy operates through theological frameworks, institutional structures, and psychological mechanisms that collectively prevent critical examination of this supposed virtue. The theological dimension of this conspiracy involves what Nietzsche called the sanctification of submission. Religious texts and teachings consistently portray humility not merely as a human virtue, but as reflecting the very nature of the divine, despite abundant contradictory evidence within those same traditions. When Jesus claims divine status, confronts authorities, and speaks with uncompromising certainty, these actions are interpreted as compatible with perfect humility. When God in the Hebrew Bible displays jealousy, wrath, and demand for exclusive worship, these qualities are similarly reconciled with divine humility through increasingly tortured theological reasoning. This selective interpretation serves theological purposes. It maintains humility's status as unquestionable virtue by associating it with divinity itself, even when the actual portrayal of the divine contradicts the very qualities humility supposedly embodies. Institutionally, the maintenance of humility as supreme virtue creates powerful organizational advantages. Nietzsche documented how religious institutions benefit from promoting a virtue that makes adherents less likely to question authority, more accepting of hierarchical structures, and more willing to attribute their dissatisfactions to their own moral inadequacy rather than to institutional failings. If humility were reconceived as accurate self-assessment rather than self-diminishment, it might actually lead to more critical evaluation of religious institutions themselves, an outcome those institutions have powerful incentives to avoid. This institutional self-protection explains why challenges to traditional conceptions of humility are met with such intense resistance, even when those challenges come from within religious traditions themselves. The psychological dimension of the conspiracy operates through what Nietzsche called the internalization of moral authority. By elevating humility to virtue status, moral systems create a situation where the individual constantly monitors and judges their own thoughts, feelings, and actions against an impossible standard of selflessness. This internalized moral surveillance makes external control less necessary by creating what modern psychology would call an authoritarian superego, an internal moral authority that continually finds the self wanting and in need of correction. The effectiveness of this psychological mechanism explains why moral systems maintain humility as central even when its practice correlates with negative psychological outcomes. The virtue's value lies not in its contribution to well-being, but in its facilitation of psychological self-governance. Educational systems within religious and moral traditions further reinforce this conspiracy. Nietzsche observed how moral education typically emphasizes the dangers of pride and the necessity of humility without providing any framework for critical evaluation of these concepts themselves. Virtues like courage, justice, or wisdom are presented as requiring prudent application and balance, while humility is portrayed as unconditionally good, regardless of context or degree. This educational asymmetry prevents the development of critical moral thinking about humility specifically, maintaining its special status as the virtue beyond questioning. Perhaps most insidious is what Nietzsche called the moralization of inquiry itself. By making humility a prerequisite for legitimate moral questioning, religious frameworks create a situation where the very act of critically examining humility can be dismissed as evidence of its absence. This circular logic effectively prevents any serious investigation of the virtue's nature and function. If you question whether humility as traditionally conceived might sometimes be harmful, This questioning itself becomes evidence of your prideful lack of humility and therefore grounds for dismissing your concern. This self-sealing system makes humility uniquely resistant to critical examination. The result is a comprehensive system that maintains humility as an unquestionable virtue despite evidence of its problematic nature and functions. This conspiracy persists not primarily through conscious deception, but through interlocking theological, institutional, psychological, and educational mechanisms that collectively prevent critical examination of this supposedly self-evident good. The most disturbing aspect of humility's elevation to supreme virtue status isn't just the questionable nature of the virtue itself, but the systematic ways in which critical perspectives have been actively suppressed. Nietzsche's analysis of this suppression revealed not just disagreement with alternative views, but a pattern of specific techniques used to delegitimize any questioning of humility's unconditional goodness. This pattern appears with remarkable consistency across different religious traditions and historical periods, suggesting not random resistance, but a predictable immune response whenever the virtue's nature and function are critically examined. The primary mechanism for this suppression has been moral dismissal rather than intellectual engagement. When figures like Nietzsche questioned whether humility as traditionally conceived might sometimes function as a tool of control rather than a path to spiritual advancement, their critiques weren't met with reasoned theological or philosophical responses, but with moral condemnation. Nietzsche documented how consistently critics of humility were characterized not as offering potentially valuable perspective, but as revealing their own moral corruption. This ad hominem approach effectively prevented serious engagement with the substance of the critique by focusing attention on the supposed moral failing of the critic rather than the content of their analysis. Theological authorities reinforced this suppression through selective interpretation of religious texts. Nietzsche analyzed how passages that might suggest a more complex understanding of humility were consistently downplayed or reinterpreted to maintain the virtue's unconditional status. Jesus' confrontations with religious authorities, his claims of divine status, and his uncompromising moral certainty all suggest a more nuanced relationship with humility than traditional Christian teaching acknowledges. Yet these aspects of the gospel narratives were systematically subordinated to interpretations that maintained humility's status as the foundational Christian virtue. This selective emphasis created the impression that religious texts uniformly support traditional conceptions of humility, when closer analysis reveals far more complexity and nuance. Institutional mechanisms further enforce this suppression. Nietzsche observed how religious organizations developed specific responses to those who questioned traditional understandings of humility. Rather than engaging with substantive critiques, institutions often marginalized critical voices through formal censure, exclusion from discourse, or questioning of their spiritual authenticity. Suggesting that humility might sometimes function as a tool of control rather than a path to spiritual advancement could lead to accusations of heresy, spiritual immaturity, or moral corruption. This institutional response effectively discouraged open inquiry into the nature and function of the virtue by making such questioning personally and professionally dangerous. Cultural reinforcement extended this suppression beyond formal religious contexts. Nietzsche documented how artistic depictions, popular stories, and cultural narratives consistently portrayed humble characters as morally superior and questioning characters as spiritually suspect. This created a pervasive background assumption that made critical perspectives on humility seem counterintuitive, despite their explanatory power. When cultural representation overwhelmingly portrays humble self-diminishment as the path to moral excellence, questioning this portrayal requires swimming against a powerful cultural current, making critical perspectives appear inherently suspect, regardless of their intellectual merit. Perhaps most troubling was what Nietzsche called the silencing of experience. He collected numerous accounts of individuals who recognized through direct experience that conventional humility had led not to spiritual advancement, but to psychological harm, diminished effectiveness, or increased vulnerability to exploitation. Yet when they attempted to articulate these experiences, they were systematically redirected toward greater self-blame, their negative outcomes attributed to insufficient or improperly practiced humility, rather than recognized as potential evidence of problems with the virtue itself. This created a closed system where negative experiences that might challenge traditional conceptions of humility were incorporated into rather than challenging those very conceptions. This multi-layered suppression has resulted in what Nietzsche termed the Great Forgetting, a collective amnesia about the psychological and social functions of humility as a moral concept. The final question isn't whether humility has value, but what form of humility truly serves human flourishing rather than human diminishment. Nietzsche's revolutionary insight wasn't a wholesale rejection of the virtue, but its fundamental reconceptualization, transforming humility from a tool of psychological and social control into a quality that might genuinely enhance life. What if true humility isn't making yourself small, but accurately acknowledging your actual scale? What if it isn't denying your capabilities, but recognizing both your powers and their limits? What if it isn't constant self-suspicion, but honest self-assessment, without either inflation or deflation? This requires a fundamental shift in how we understand the virtue. Rather than defining humility as self-abasement or self-diminishment, we might reconceive it as accurate self-perception, neither pretending to be less than you are nor claiming to be more. This reconceptualized humility wouldn't involve denying your strengths, capabilities, or accomplishments, but acknowledging them without either exaggeration or false modesty. It wouldn't require constant self-criticism or perpetual sense of unworthiness, but would involve honest recognition of both your capacities and limitations. This form of humility enhances rather than diminishes life because it's grounded in truth rather than in psychological or social utility. The practical implications are transformative. Instead of the traditional practice of humility, which involves making yourself artificially small, you might cultivate what Nietzsche called the great honesty, a rigorous commitment to seeing yourself as you actually are, rather than as moral frameworks dictate you should be. This doesn't mean abandoning moral aspiration, but grounding that aspiration in accurate self-perception, rather than in self-diminishment. The question shifts from, how can I make myself smaller and less significant, to, how can I accurately perceive my actual scale and significance, neither inflating nor deflating either? For those who have practiced traditional humility and found it spiritually or psychologically depleting, this perspective offers a revolutionary alternative. Rather than assuming your depletion indicates moral failure or insufficient spiritual advancement, you might consider whether the very conception of humility you've been practicing is itself problematic. Perhaps your spiritual and psychological growth requires not more self-diminishment, but its replacement with honest self-assessment, a form of humility grounded in truth rather than in moral utility. This isn't abandoning virtue, but reconceiving it in a way that serves human flourishing rather than human control. This reconceptualization illuminates why Nietzsche's approach to humility was so radically different from conventional moral teaching. His call for the revaluation of all values wasn't a rejection of virtue, but its transformation, shifting from morality based on psychological and social utility to ethics grounded in life affirmation and honest self-perception. His critique of Christian humility wasn't aimed at promoting arrogance or dismissing spiritual development, but at exposing how a supposedly divine virtue often functions to diminish rather than enhance human potential. The transformation extends to how we understand spiritual development itself. If genuine humility involves accurate self-perception rather than self-diminishment, then spiritual growth might require not more self-criticism, but greater self-honesty. This doesn't mean abandoning moral aspiration, but grounding that aspiration in clear recognition of who you actually are, rather than in perpetual sense of inadequacy. The spiritual question shifts from, how can I become less, to, how can I see myself clearly and develop in accordance with my actual nature and potential? This approach doesn't reject spiritual discipline, but transforms its purpose from self-diminishment to self-clarification. For religious communities, this understanding offers both challenge and opportunity. The challenge involves shifting from institutions that reinforce conventional humility as a tool of control to communities that support accurate self-perception as a foundation for authentic growth. This doesn't mean abandoning all traditional religious practices, but re-examining their psychological functions and effects, preserving those that enhance life while transforming or abandoning those that diminish it. The opportunity lies in recovering what Nietzsche saw as religion's potential to serve as a vehicle for human development rather than human constraint. The most profound transformation comes in our relationship with our own nature and capacities. If conventional humility involves a perpetual battle against natural human qualities deemed spiritually suspect, reconceived humility involves honest acknowledgement of those qualities as the foundation for genuine development. This doesn't mean uncritical acceptance of every impulse or desire, but recognition that true growth emerges from who you actually are, rather than from ongoing rejection of your nature. Genuine humility becomes not denial of self, but honest relationship with self, neither inflating nor denying your actual qualities and capacities. This understanding doesn't require abandoning religion, but may actually deepen religious experience by reclaiming its life-affirming potential. Many mystical traditions have long recognized that spiritual maturity involves moving beyond conventional moral frameworks to more nuanced understanding of human nature and its relationship with the divine. The humility as honesty insight doesn't reject religious teaching but penetrates to a deeper understanding that transcends the psychological and social functions that often shape conventional moral instruction. The invitation is clear. Rather than continuing to practice a form of humility that may actually diminish your capacity for excellence and authentic connection, you might cultivate what Nietzsche called the great health, a condition where natural human vitality is neither denied as sinful nor expressed as domination, but channeled into creative and life-affirming forms. This isn't rejecting virtue, but transforming it from a tool of constraint into a vehicle for genuine human flourishing. Will you continue practicing a form of humility that requires perpetual self-diminishment and ongoing sense of unworthiness? Or will you have the courage to cultivate a more honest humility grounded in accurate self-perception, acknowledging both your capacities and limitations without exaggerating either? The choice isn't between virtue and vice, but between a conception of virtue that serves human diminishment and one that serves human flourishing. The real lie about Christian humility wasn't that it exists, but that its traditional form represents the only or highest expression of this supposed virtue. The path to authentic human excellence might require not more humility, but its fundamental transformation.